Hey everybody, and welcome to the 9th episode of the Level Creation Guide for Half-Life. In the previous episode, we learned how to use scripted entities to control the monsters in our level. In this episode, we're going to be learning how to create the alien environment of Xen. This alien world is vastly different from the indoor and outdoor areas by its emphasis on platforming, increased environmental hazards, and its strange level design. Although it may be different from the areas we've already created, it really isn't that difficult. Here are the following 6 parts of this episode that will go over how to make a basic Xen environment. Let's begin this episode with the first part called Sky. Unlike the outdoor areas that we created back in episode 6, the Xen environment will have a sky in all directions. This means that we'll have to create a larger room that will fit every block and entity inside of it. Let's begin by creating this larger room. Let's jump into Jack and use the block tool to create a large 1024 by 1024 unit room with the ceiling height being 1024 units tall. Then, let's select all our room's walls, floor, and ceiling and apply the null texture to it. Once the null texture is applied, texture the inner faces with the sky texture. If your 3D view is not displaying a sky, but instead a light blue color, then simply click on this button above the top viewport to enable the sky texture to be shown. Now, let's change our sky texture by selecting Map at the top, then Map Properties. The World Spawn window will appear, allowing us to deselect the Environment Map option and choose a different sky for our level. There are plenty of skies to choose from, which all depends on what type of level you're going to create. Let's choose the Neb 7 sky and exit out of the World Spawn window. There we go, our Xen Sky is almost complete. All we need next to finish our sky is to create a light environment entity in order for our sky to give light. Using the Entity tool, let's create a light environment entity. Since this is a Xen Sky, we are going to want to change the color of the light our sky gives. Go to the brightness setting, let's decrease the brightness to 100 and select the Pick Color option. For our Xen Sky, choose this pre-selected green color and slide down the brightness until it's about 2/4 of the way down in order for it to be a good balance. Once adjusted, press OK and we should have our color. Now, let's change the yaw compass direction to 120 to aim the light northwest and enter in the value of -45 to our pitch option so our light will be aiming at a downward 45-degree angle. Once entered, let's exit out and our Xen Sky will be complete. Let's move on to the second part of this episode where we're going to be creating a couple floating rocks for our player to spawn and stand on. To create a standard floating rock, the easiest way is to do the following. Select the block tool and choose the rock option. Increase the number of faces to 50, as this will increase the smoothness and detail to our floating rock. Then, create a 256 by 256 unit rock with the height being 256 also. Once the rock is created, rotate it until you find a decent aesthetic position for the bottom half of the rock to be. Once positioned, Use the clipping tool and cut a third off the top of the block to create a flat top. Once cut, let's now texture our rock with the null texture. Let's now texture the bottom with the Xeno Muck1A texture. And then texture the flat top with the Xeno 6FLR2 texture. Once finished texturing, let's position this rock toward a corner of our level and create an info player start entity on top of it facing towards the middle of our Xen room. And that should be it. We have created our first floating rock platform. Let's continue now to use the same process, but this time, let's create a larger floating rock with varied levels of terrain on top. To start, select the block tool, use the same rock and face options, and create a larger 448 by 448 unit rock, with the height being 448 also. Once created, let's now apply the null texture to it. After being null textured, adjust it until you find its best looking position and use the clipping tool to cut off the top. Once cut, be sure to position the flat top to be the same level as our other floating rock's flat top. Now, texture the bottom and top with the same textures as we used before. And position this block around the middle of the level, but a little ways away from our first floating rock. Now that we've created our large floating rock, let's continue to create some varied terrain on its flat top. While we could use spike shapes to create varied terrain on the top of our large floating rock, let's instead create a more realistic terrain by using the same technique we used to create cliffs with back in episode 6. The technique we used was by cutting a thin square block diagonally across the middle, duplicating and stacking them to however tall we wanted our cliff to be. We then use the vertex tool to manually adjust the cut blocks to different sizes, creating a realistic varied cliff face. We are going to be using this same technique, but instead of stacking our cut blocks, we will be placing them down across the top of our large floating rock and manually editing them from there. Let's use this technique to create our varied terrain. Start by clicking on the block tool, making sure we have the block shape selected, and creating a 64 by 64 unit block with the height being 64 units and the depth being 16 units. Once created, rotate and position our newly created block to be touching flat on the top of our large floating rock. Then, let's use the clipping tool and cut it in half, keeping both sides. After being cut while both sides are selected, press Ctrl G to group them together. Let's now duplicate our block until we have created 5 rows and 5 columns of this block. Make sure to have the same number of rows and columns in order to make all our block edges flat when we start using the vertex tool later. Also, don't worry about some of the squares being over the floating rock's edge. We will fix this while we're using the vertex tool. Once our 5x5 is created, select all the squares and press Ctrl G to group them all together. Let's now select the Browse Texture button on the right hand side of Jack, select the Xeno 14 texture, and hit the Apply Texture button to apply the texture on all sides. There we go, we've created our terrain base. Let's now begin to shape it into a varied terrain. Select our terrain base, then select the vertex tool icon, and our terrain base will appear with hundreds of white and orange dots. Something I didn't mention back in episode 6 was what these white and orange points are. The white points are our vertices, and the orange points are what Jack calls edges. An edge is a point located between two vertices that, when moved, will move both of its attached vertices along with it. We can also cycle and toggle between displaying only white vertex points, only orange edge points, or both by pressing Shift V. Let's cycle between these options until just the white vertices are showing. This will make it easier for us to see what we're doing. Let's now begin to shape our terrain, but follow along carefully or else problems could arise. The first thing we want to do is make all the corners of our terrain base flat against the floor. To do this, use the front and side viewports and pull down the top layer corner vertex point until it merges with the bottom layer vertex point. Do this until all 4 sides are pulled down and flat. Next, let's use the top viewport and pull down the most outside vertex points out randomly to break up the square and create a more organic shape. Be sure to use the bracket keys to increase and decrease the grid size for better accuracy. This is the time to make sure our terrain is not over the edge of our floating rock. Once finished in the top viewport, move on to the front and side viewports and pull the top vertex points in different directions. This can take some time, but be sure to be very minimal when moving the vertex points around to avoid making invalid shapes. Lastly, while still using the vertex tool, right-click onto our terrain and press the option Triangulate. This option will automatically make invalid faces be cut into triangles so it won't give us any errors or compiling issues. Awesome work! We've created our first alien floor terrain. Let's continue on to the third part of this episode, where we're going to add some detail to our floating rocks by creating a new type of entity called Xen entities. There are 6 Xen entities in total that Jack offers us, called Xen Hair, Plant Light, Tree, and Spore Small, Medium, and Large. We can use these Xen entities to add detailing to our Xen levels. The only Xen entity that requires some adjustment to fully function proper is the Xen Plant Light entity. This little guy emits light when he isn't harassed by the player and is a good option as a way to provide light in your Xen levels. However, by default his light tip doesn't glow and he cannot emit light on his own. This means that we're going to have to adjust a couple of his unique settings and create a separate light entity for him to control. Let's start by using the Entity tool and creating a Xen Plant Light entity. You may need to press Enter after typing in Xen Plant Light. To give a glow to his light tip, we will first have to go to the FX color option and press the Pick Color to select a color for his light tip. Let's choose a lighter orange color. Once chosen, press OK. Now that we have his color, we'll need to go to the FX Amount option and add the value of 210 into this option so the orange glow will be semi-transparent. Once added, exit out of the entity and let's move him onto the same floating rock facing towards the player. You may need to move the info player start back or increase the rock size to fit both. Now that we have our plant light settings adjusted and positioned near the player, all we need now is to create a light entity for our plant light to control. But instead of using a regular light entity for him, let's create and learn a new light entity called the Light Spot entity. Unlike the regular light entity, the Light Spot entity emits a directional and adjustable cone-shaped light with an added fade effect. This light is the go-to light entity to use for most lights, as most lights are directional in Half-Life. In the Light Spot's attributes section, we have some familiar options and a couple new options called the Inner Bright Angle and the Outer Bright Angle. The inner bright angle controls how large of an area the light is produced in, and the outer angle controls how large of an area the fade effect is produced in. To configure this entity for our Xen Plant Light, let's increase the inner bright angle to 64 units to produce a light in a larger area, and then increase the outer bright angle to 72 units so it'll produce a fade effect for 8 units around the light circle. Once our inner and outer angles are adjusted, let's go to the yaw compass. We don't necessarily have to adjust this because our pitch value by default is -90 degrees, meaning it's pointing down, but let's just select down on our yaw compass anyway for teaching purposes. Next, let's add the name Xen Light 01 to the name option so our Xen Plant Light can target this entity. Once the name is added, let's go to the brightness setting and select the Pick Color option. We will want to choose a darker orange color for our light's color. Once chosen, press OK and exit out of our Light Spot entity. There we go, we've finished up setting up our Light Spot entity. Let's move it directly above but not touching our Xen Plant Light entity. You can place the Light Spot entity above the light tip or base, it makes little difference. Now, in order for our Xen Plant Light entity to control the Light Spot entity, Let's enter into our Xen Plant Lights entity browser and enter in our light spot's name, XenLight01, into its target option. And that should be all we need for our Xen Plant Light entity to work properly. Let's continue to use the Xen Plant Light and Light combo entity and place a few more of these on our large floating rock. To do this, select our Xen Plant Light and Light Spot entity and press Ctrl G to group them together. Once grouped, duplicate and position more of these around our large floating rock to add further detail. Now that we've placed our Xen Plant Light and Light Spot combo around, let's use a couple more of our Xen entities and place them on our small and large floating rocks. There we go, our large and small floating rocks are looking good. Before we continue to the next part of this episode, there are two final details we're going to be adding to our Xen level. The first is the common cucumber-looking tree located everywhere in Xen. And the second is an ambient sound playing in the background of our level. Let's start by creating a cucumber tree first. To create a cucumber tree, select on the block tool and click on the spike shape. Set the faces number to 6 and create a 64 by 64 unit spike with the height being 384 units tall. Let's now select our newly created spike and apply the null texture to it. Once null textured, let's now texture our spike with the Xeno 6W1 texture. Try to align the texture on each face the best you can. Sometimes this can take some time. Be sure to also click on this icon to enable texture lock so our alignments will not be affected by moving our cucumber tree shortly. After aligning, use the clipping tool to cut and delete a small portion off the top of our spike. Once cut, position our cucumber tree somewhere on the small floating rock. You may need to move the info player start and other Xen entities to make some space. Great work! Now that our cucumber tree is created and positioned, let's create another but larger cucumber tree and place it on our large floating rock. To do this, simply duplicate our cucumber tree and place the duplicate in the middle of our varied terrain on our large floating rock. Now, let's increase the thickness and height of our duplicated cucumber tree to be somewhat proportionate to the large floating rock. The texture alignment on our large cucumber tree may be affected, so try your best to realign them, and that should be it. There we go, we created a couple cucumber trees. Let's now add the final detail, which is an ambient sound effect. To do this, let's use the Entity tool and create an ambient generic entity. While in its attribute section, select the wave name option and press the dotted icon. The sound folder directory window will appear, allowing us to choose a .wave file for us to use as our ambient sound. Let's enter into the ambience folder, as this folder will contain all the ambient sound effects. There are a bunch here that we can choose from, but one of the best ones to use for a Xen level is the alien squit.wave file, which sounds like this. Let's use this wave audio file by selecting it and pressing open. Now that we've chosen a wave file, let's go into our flag section and select play everywhere. This means that our entity will play the audio everywhere in the level. Let's now exit out of the ambient generic entity and position it somewhere towards the middle of our level. Once positioned, let's press F9 and test out our Xen level. Great job, our alien ambient sound is working properly. Now that we've finished our detailing, we are ready to continue on to the fourth part of this episode called Moving Platform. In this part, we're going to create one of those alien platforms seen from the Xen chapter to use as a transport between both of our floating rocks. We're going to be using the same knowledge we acquired back in episode 7 from when we created the lift and use it to create this alien moving platform. Let's begin by creating this moving platform. To start, select the block tool, choose the spike shape, and increase the number of faces from 4 to 8. Then, create a 128 by 128 unit spike with the height being 32 units tall. Once created, flip it around and make sure its flat top is level with the floating rocks. Once positioned, use the clipping tool and cut off the spike tip. Once cut, texture the bottom of this block with the Xeno 2W1 texture, and then texture the floor of the platform with the Xeno 4C1C texture. Now, in order for our newly created platform to travel between both floating rocks, we're going to have to select it and transform it into a func train entity. While in our func trains attributes section, let's add the name AlienPlat01 to its name option, and then increase its speed option to 200. This will make our platform move at a good speed. Let's also add the name Path01 to our first stop target option, just to save us time later from coming back to this entity. Once entered, let's exit out of our func train entity and our platform should be all set. We are now going to proceed to set up a couple path points for our func train to travel between. Let's select our path tool and create our first path point by holding down Shift and left-clicking somewhere in the top viewport. Before being created, a window will appear asking us for a name, class, and direction. Let's add the name of our func train's first stop target option, Path01, to its name option. Then, keep its class as the path corner and select circular for its direction. Once done, press OK and our first path point will be created. Now, while still using the path tool, select our first path point and create a second by holding down Shift and left-clicking near our first path point in the top viewport. Let's now make them both level with our floating rocks and platform by drag selecting them both and moving them up. Once level, let's move one of our path points close to our large floating rock, and then move the other path point to the small floating rock. Be sure both path points are not too close to the floating rocks, or else our moving platform will collide into them in-game. Now that our path points are positioned, let's add a 3-second wait time to both points so our platforms will have to wait 3 seconds at both locations before traveling to the next. To do this, select both path points, right-click on one of them, and select the Properties option. A window will appear with some options, but let's just focus on the weight option. Let's add the value of 3 to this option and press OK. There we go, our path points and func train are all set up. The last thing left to do is to create a trigger once entity to activate our moving platform to start its travel between both points. To do this, select the block tool, be sure to select the block shape, and create a block touching but not completely covering our info player start. This will make our trigger once entity immediately activate our moving platform to begin traveling on level load. After being created and positioned, let's texture this block with the AAA texture. Once textured, let's now transform it into a trigger once entity and add our func train's name, AlienPlat01, to its target option. Once entered, let's exit out of the trigger once entity and playtest our level. Awesome work! We have created a moving platform linking both of our floating rocks together. Let's continue to the fifth part of this episode, called Gravity. In this part, we're going to be changing the gravity force in our level. Let's start by creating a AAA textured block, touching but not completely covering our info player start like we did with our previous trigger once entity. This will make it the second entity that will automatically trigger on level load. Once created, let's transform this block into a new trigger entity called the Trigger Gravity entity. The Trigger Gravity entity allows us to change the gravity value for our level. The gravity option in its attributes section is where we can set the value from 0 to 1, with 1 being the normal gravity and 0 being zero gravity. Let's set this number to 0.6, and this will make our gravity in our level be reduced so we can jump and float longer. Once entered, let's exit out of our Trigger Gravity's entity browser. Now since we reduced the gravity in our Xen level, the player will be able to jump higher and further than before. We will need to expand our Xen Sky further away from the player's reach in order to prevent him from jumping and actually bumping into our sky walls. Let's quickly expand our Xen Sky by selecting both our floor and ceiling and increasing its size until it's reasonably far enough away from the player's reach. Then, let's reposition and extend all 4 walls together to seal in our Xen Sky. Make sure there are no gaps or else the void will be exposed and cause leaks in our level. Once finished, press F9 and let's test out our gravity change. Great job! We've reduced the gravity in our level and now we can jump higher and further than before. We are now ready to move on to the last part of this episode, called Save Load. Before we finish this episode, there is one last problem we are going to need to fix. Due to the skies in Half-Life not being actual endless real skies, if the player ever falls off our floating rocks or platform, he will actually be able to land on top of our sky's floor and walk across it like he's some sort of sky or moonwalker. There are a few ways to stop this from happening, but for this episode, we're going to be creating a save load system to solve this problem. This is how the save load system works. On level load, the player will spawn and activate a new trigger entity called the Trigger Autosave entity. This entity simply creates a save point for the player. Then, if the player falls off a floating rocks or moving platform, he will fall into a large Trigger Once entity covering the bottom of our level. This Trigger Once entity will then activate its target entity, which is another new entity called the Player Load Saved entity. This entity will fade the player's screen and load the player back to his most recent save. It may sound a little complicated at first, but don't worry, it's a lot easier than it sounds. Let's create the save load system for our Xen level. To start, let's reposition our info player start and his two touching entities forward to be a little further away from the edge of our floating rock. Once moved, let's create 4 AAA textured blocks surrounding but not touching our info player start. Unfortunately, the entity we're going to be transforming these blocks into does not work if it's placed on top of the player. Once finished, while all 4 blocks are selected, transform them into the Trigger Autosave entity. This entity has no settings for us to adjust, so we can exit out of the entity and it will be all set up. Now, let's create a new AAA textured block, but this time across the entire bottom of our Xen level. Make its height to be somewhere below the middle of our floating rocks, so when the player falls, it'll be triggered as soon as possible. Once adjusted, let's transform it into a Trigger Once entity and add the name Fall to its target option. Let's now exit out of the entity browser and use the entity tool to create the Player Load Saved entity. In the Player Load Saved attribute section, there are some new options we can adjust. The Fade Duration option is how long it will take for our screen to fade to black. Let's change its default value to 0.5 seconds. The Hold Fade option is how long the screen will remain black. Let's also change this value to 0.5 seconds. The Fade Alpha option controls if we're able to see through the fade color. This option can be set from 0 to 255, where 0 is 100% see-throughable and 255 isn't. Let's leave this option at 255. The Fade Color option allows us to change the fade color, but let's just leave this one at its default black color. The Message to Display and the Show Message Delay allows us to add a message when the player triggers this entity and how long of a delay before the message is shown. Let's skip these two options. The Reload Delay option is how long of a delay between being activated and actually reloading the game to a save point. Let's change the setting to 0.5 seconds also, so it'll be fast when we trigger it. Lastly, let's add the name Fall to this entity so when the player falls onto our trigger once, it will activate our Player Load Saved entity. And that should be it. Not too bad, right? Let's exit out of our Player Load Saved entity and press F9 to do a final playtest. Congratulations, you've learned how to create a Xen environment. Thank you so much for watching this extra long video, and I hope you enjoyed it. As always, if you have any questions or problems, be sure to ask me in the comments below and I'll try my best to help. I hope to see you back in the 10th episode of the Level Creation Guide for Half-Life.